Good morning.
Morning.
So our office spends a lot of time working with business officials of school districts, helping them project revenue and do things like that. And it was really nice to get the opportunity to do this and try to take a step back because we spend our non-legislative sessions working with school districts and legislative sessions kind of in the weeds of the school finance formulas. And so it was really nice to take a step back and say sort of where have we been over the last 10 years, what have we been trying to accomplish, and what are the problems facing our school systems today in Texas. And so that's what we're going to try to share with you a little bit today. The first thing we're going to talk about is what is required of a good school finance system in Texas, what's the educational context we're working in, what makes it hard to do this right in Texas, what are the constitutional requirements for school finance system in Texas, and what has the Supreme Court said, how has the Supreme Court interpreted those constitutional requirements. We're going to talk a little bit about the legislative response to those issues, and then at the end we're going to wrap it up by talking about the litigation that's recently been filed on behalf of a number of school districts, what the arguments are, what the time frame's likely to be, and kind of what that process will look like. I'm happy to stop and answer questions as we go along. It probably would make it more interesting for you guys, so if you need clarification at any point, please feel free to interrupt. I think a copy of the presentation is in your books, and our website is at the end of that, and so you can get to us or email me if you have questions or need additional information later on, so feel free to use that. This is my favorite quotation about school finance that I've seen. It was written in 1991, but it's every bit as true today as it was at that time, which is that school finance reform in Texas is beginning to resemble a 19th century Russian novel. The storyline runs across generations, the plot is complex, the prose is tedious, and everybody dies in the end. And it was often said when I started this that school finance was the third rail of Texas politics, and it's a really difficult thing for lawmakers to want to get involved in. It involves people's money and people's kids, and there's a lot of emotion and anger that can come out around that issue, and so a lot of times it gets avoided, but we'll talk a little about that as we go along. In terms of what our state constitution says about, what is the bare minimum that the state has to do in terms of school finance, it says, a general diffusion of knowledge being essential to the preservation of liberties and rights of the people, it shall be the duty of the legislature of the state, so it's a state responsibility, right? That's a key component there, to establish and make suitable provision for the support and maintenance of an efficient system of public free schools. So I highlighted in blue in that statement some of the phrases that have been litigated really since the early 90s and late 80s in terms of school finance. The first is a general diffusion of knowledge, so that's your goal, that knowledge has to be diffused generally throughout the population in order to preserve democracy. That the legislature has to make suitable provision for that, so they have to provide enough funding that they have suitably funded the general diffusion of knowledge, and they have to do it in an efficient way. And really, efficiency was the first word that got litigated in school finance, and that was interpreted by the courts during Edgewood 1 to relate to equity. And the idea was that it was not efficient to arrange our property wealth across the state into districts where some districts could tax at very low levels and provide a very high quality education, and other school districts could tax at very high rates and still not be able to provide an adequate education. That was fundamentally an inefficient way to organize ourselves, and it was the state's responsibility to organize the state in such a way that they could provide for the general diffusion of knowledge. And so that's what really got Texas going in terms of litigation around the school finance system. Most recently, the phrase that was litigated back in 2005 in the West Orange Cove litigation was a separate constitutional provision that says no state ad valorem taxes shall be levied upon any property within the state. And what that means constitutionally is that the state has reserved the property tax for local governments And so the state is not supposed to rely on property taxes. That's a local issue. And what had happened at the time was that local districts were all taxing at pretty close to the same rate, which was the maximum rate allowed by law. And the Supreme Court found they were using up basically all of that rate to do things that the state told them they had to do. And so although the state wasn't directly collecting taxes, it was still local governments that were collecting them. They were collecting all of them to achieve a state purpose. And the Supreme Court said that that was unconstitutional. So those are the basic phrases that are going to come back over and over during this story, essentially. So what did the Supreme Court say? Well, I skipped Edgewood 1 through 4 and went to the most recent time the Supreme Court has ruled to pull out a few key phrases in terms of where was the Supreme Court the last time we saw them in 2005, kind of what was their judgment about the school finance system at that time. And at that time, the litigant districts argued that the system was inefficient, that they were not achieving the general diffusion of knowledge, and that it was a state property tax. So they really brought all three claims at that time. They only prevailed on one of those claims, which was the state property tax claim. In terms of the general diffusion of knowledge, the Supreme Court sort of, to me, said, wow, it looks pretty bad, but it's not quite bad enough yet. So they said there is substantial evidence that the public education system has reached the point where continued improvement will not be possible absent significant change, whether that change take the form of increased funding, improved efficiencies, or better methods of education. So they did, and the district court had actually ruled that we weren't providing the general diffusion of knowledge. The Supreme Court reversed on that, although they provided this warning. But in the end, they said an impending constitutional violation is not an existing one. We see things getting really bad, but we're not bad enough yet, essentially. And it remains to be seen whether the system's predicted drift toward constitutional inadequacy will be avoided by legislative reaction to widespread calls for changes. So what we're going to talk a little bit about today is what was the legislative reaction to that, and do we think that they've prevented this drift towards inadequacy. In terms of efficiency, what they've said was that local communities must have, in order to avoid a state property tax, local communities have to have the discretion to raise enough money to achieve all the things the state requires them to do, and then if they want to, do some things locally to enrich, or choose to tax at a lower level and not do those things to enrich. They have to have some discretion to either choose to implement or not implement some local programs. But in order to be sure the system remains efficient, that supplementation cannot be so great that it in effect destroys the efficiency of the entire system. And so there needs to be some equalization in the system to be sure that kids have meaningfully equal opportunities to an education in this state. And then finally, the state cannot provide for local supplementation, pressure the districts by increasing standards and not providing essentially the state funds that are needed, pressure the districts to tax at maximum rates, and then argue that it's not controlling the local tax rate. So what they said was that the state had too much control over local tax rates. So, you know, we get frustrated with the legislature around the area of school finance because there are a lot of problems that have not been addressed. But at the same time, it is a very, very difficult thing to deal with. And so I just threw some numbers up here to keep in mind in terms of how difficult a ship this is to turn around. We currently educate 4.8 million students in Texas. We have 660,000 employees, about half of which are teachers. And you'll hear people during the legislative session get very frustrated, right, because only half of the public school employees are teachers. The rest must be sitting in central office not doing anything. And we have to remind them pretty regularly that most of those other folks are driving buses, right, serving meals, cleaning buildings, working in the offices, answering the phones, all of those things that have to happen every day. Most of the people in public schools, they may only half of them be teachers, but they're people you see every day when you drop your kids off in school. There are some people in central office, but they don't make up the bulk of that number. We have 1,200 school districts and 8,100 campuses, and we spend almost $35.5 billion in operating expenditures alone. So this is, and that's per year, this is a big ship to turn around. It doesn't turn on a dime. In terms of wealth per student, you know that most of the money, and we'll show you a graph on this later, but most of the money in the school system comes from local taxes. But the wealth, the property wealth per student in this state ranges from $18,000 a student in wealth to over $5.4 million a student in wealth. Trying to equalize that is not an easy thing to achieve, right? And that's why we have recapture. The state cannot afford to give enough money for all districts to spend like they had $5.4 million in wealth per student in their district. And so that's why we've created in some ways the structure that we have. We also have a very rapidly changing student population in Texas and a very rapidly growing student population in Texas. And then finally, our legislature has actually been fairly ambitious in terms of the standards that we've been implementing. I don't know how many of you have read about the new end-of-course assessments that are coming online this year. But they do have a fairly ambitious goal for student achievement in the state. The question is whether they've lined that up in any way against what resources it would take to help the children achieve those standards. Just wanted to show you a little bit about what the student population in Texas looks like. So I picked 1994-95 as the base year because that's what year I had data for in our database back at the office. And then 2010 and 11 as the most recent year for which we had data. If you look at the bottom line there, we added 1.2 million students over that time frame to our Texas public schools. And so that's a 34% increase in the number of kids that we're trying to educate over that time. Virtually all of that growth was among children who qualify for the federal free and reduced price lunch program. And so that's a significant challenge that our teachers are trying to work with in our classrooms today. So we went in 94-95 from 46% of the kids in our public school classrooms qualifying for free or reduced price lunch to now almost 60% of kids qualifying for free or reduced price lunch. And it's interesting, our funding formulas do provide a small bump to help educate kids who are low income. But you think that's not just the average anymore, that's most of our kids. That's what we're doing in Texas schools today. We also have had a significant growth in the number of at-risk students. That's kids who have shown some academic trouble, either failed a state test or been retained at a grade, something like that, so they get the label at-risk, which means they're at risk of not completing school. That's grown over those years, as has the number of limited English proficient students grown by 83% over that time frame. So in terms of thinking about the numbers again, we grow, well, first of all, we provide on average about $7,000 a kid. And I pulled this out of our model. The funding formulas, the base funding formulas provide about $7,000 a student. And we add about 75,000 students every year to our Texas public school system. So if you think about that, you're starting out with $500,000 cost every year just to stay where you are. If you didn't do anything ever to provide a pay increase for teachers or cost of living increase or anything like that, that's $500 million a year, $500 million a year. And if you think about, well, what if we were to provide like 3% increase for inflation, which inflation hasn't been running that high in recent years, but we expect one day it will again, then you're looking at another $1 billion a year on top of that. So it's a big system that requires a lot of fuel as long as we're growing at this pace. And we talked a little about performance expectations. I just thought I'd throw them up here on a chart so you'd have them. When I went to high school, and I graduated from a public high school in Texas, we had to take 2 years of science, 3 years of math, and 4 years of social studies and English, and then we could spend the rest of the time taking fun theater classes. I did a lot of theater classes, PE classes, whatever. So the legislature has come in and said, no, we want our children to be taking math and science and social studies and English every year in high school. So they implemented what we call the 4x4 requirement, which is for most kids, there's a few exceptions, but for most kids, they've got to get through 4 years in all the core subjects. And then they got worried that, will those courses be of high quality? You can put everybody in a course, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're learning the material that's on the curriculum, and so they've established end-of-course exams. So they not only have to take all of those courses, but then up through their junior year, they have to pass an end-of-course assessment that says they've mastered the material in that course. And that material is supposed to be geared toward college and career readiness. And then the legislature sort of didn't seem to trust that the assessments we would put in place would be of sufficient rigor. And so they told the commissioner in statute, we want to be in the top 10 states in the country in terms of preparing kids for college. And they further directed the commissioner, you have to continually raise the standards until we get there. And they set a timeline. And so I thought, well, that's great, right? We'll raise the standards and the kids will get there. But where are we in terms of resources? Are we approaching the top 10 states nationally in terms of resources? Well, in 97, 98, that appeared to be a high water mark, and we were 36th at that time. By 2008, 09, which was before the cuts of the recent legislative session, we had fallen to 43rd. The cuts of the recent legislative session have not made that better. And I will tell you, there's a handful of places that do these state rankings, and this is one of the higher ones, 43rd. Education Week recently came out with a general report card where they give you A, B, C, D on various components, and we did significantly worse. And I think, and I've been trying to get into their methodology and understand why we did worse, I think it's because they project into a future year. So this, I don't think we're 43rd anymore. I suspect that we're worse. So, again, constitutionally, can you set the goal at top 10 and the funding level, at best down in the mid-40s? Just to share with you a little about where student performance is, when I started my job in 03 at Moke Casey, we were just switching from the old TOS test to the new tax test, right? And everybody was very nervous. It was going to be much harder. But we had this really nice decade of history that showed performance at the beginning of that test. And then over those 10 years, it had really skyrocketed. And the nice thing was that the gaps in performance between our economically advantaged and our economically disadvantaged kids had shrunk over that time. So it produced a really beautiful line graph that we put, at the top of all of our advocacy pieces. And then we implemented a new state test, the tax test. I'll go back just a second. And this is showing you the percent of kids who passed all subjects on that test. And it's still increased over that time frame, but it's less exciting to me when I look at this line graph. We started ranging from 30% to 60%, depending on the demographic group that you're looking at. And the kids who are low income always do worse on these things than kids who are not. So the gap was 31 points. We grew a lot in those first few years of implementation. But let me tell you, there's a big industry around helping kids do better on those tests, right? We get the items, we look at the items, we get study materials, and the teachers and the school districts really try to do what the state tells them to do, and what the state said to do is get better at this. And so they tend to do better, especially in those first few years. You see, though, the growth rate really slowed down in the last few years of that test, and we ended that testing program with still a 21-point gap in the percent of kids who are able to pass in the most advantaged group versus the least advantaged group on that test. Go to the next one. This is the percent of kids who score at the higher level, which is the commended level. So the first graph there was just a passing. Did you manage to get the minimum number of items right to pass, which tends to be around half the items, 55% of items correct to pass. This is the commended level, which to get commended performance on a test, you've got to get closer to 90% of the items correct. And our growth rate doesn't look nearly so good. And in fact, the gap between the advantaged kids and the not advantaged kids has grown over that time. So we have some evidence that we've improved, but we have a long way to go if we're going to be in the top 10 states in terms of college readiness. We're not there. And just to give you another little fact about this, according to TEA data, 82% of low-income students from the class of 2010 graduated on time. And there's some people who would probably disagree with that number, but that's the official TEA graduation rate for low-income kids. Of those, 38% scored well enough on either the state assessment, the SAT, or the ACT. If you did good enough on any one of those, you got credit to be considered college ready. So that means less than a third of our low-income kids both graduated on time and were college ready in 2010. So we have a long way to go, particularly with our fastest growing student population of low-income kiddos. We're going to talk a little about what the legislature has done in terms of these issues. I put this picture up because I think it's the best descriptor of what our school finance system looks like. The legislative history with school finance is to go in and try to tweak it to sort of solve the problem for who's ever yelling the loudest that session, and so that's led to a fairly complex set of funding formulas, and I won't bore you with the details of how those work, but they are kind of hopelessly confusing at this point. The policy statement, though, that the legislature has put in statute is beautiful. And if they did what they put in statute, we would really be living in a top-notch state in terms of school finance. Recognizing it's a state responsibility, that the funding system will be substantially financed through state revenue, which would make the equity problem that we talked about a little easier to solve. That we're going to provide resources that are appropriate to the student's educational needs, that are substantially equal to those available to any similar student, notwithstanding varying local economic factors. That we're going to have substantially equal access to similar revenue per student for similar tax effort, acknowledging all legitimate student and district cost differences. So that would be a really beautiful funding system if we had it. Kind of the way they've set our system up, and this is one of the few slides I have that's just a core, how do things work. There's a base tier of funding, they call that Tier 1, and that's what every kid in the state's supposed to have access to, and it's there to provide for the general diffusion of knowledge. And that takes up the biggest part, right? That's the blue bar. And then the red, green, and purple on top of that is really your local supplementation opportunity, okay? And the red actually is what we call hold harmless money, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But that's the basic structure of the funding formulas. So the purpose of Tier 1, as set forth in statute, is to provide adequate resources to provide each eligible student a basic instructional program. And that's just pulled from statute. So you get, for every kid in average daily attendance, you get what they call a basic allotment. And that amount is $4,765 for every kid. And then they take that basic amount and they adjust it because they say, well, in a really small district, it's more expensive to operate than in a big district because you can't fill up your classrooms and you have to have more administrators per student, things like that, so it costs more to operate, so they give you a bump for that. They also say, well, if you're in Dallas, it's probably more expensive to hire a teacher than it is in Dival, right? Because the competition for labor is simply higher, so they give a small adjustment for that. And then they adjust it for tax effort. One of the things about these adjustments, though, is that they were all created in the mid-'80s, which, in my opinion, mid-'80s, early '90s was the last time we really did school finance. So to the extent that Texas has changed since the early '90s, those changes are really not reflected in our state funding formulas. In addition, we provide extra funding for a host of student characteristics that would arguably make things more expensive, that would make it more expensive to educate a child. Special education status, what we call compensatory education, which means poverty, career and technology, participating in a career and technology program, bilingual education, all of those things, you get a small bump in the core funding formulas for. And then what the state does is they split that between a state share of that basic cost and a local share. And the more property wealth you have, then the higher your local share is and the lower your state share is. The less property wealth you have, then the higher the state share is. So that for some very poor school districts, almost all of that is state funded. For other school districts, it's almost all locally funded. And just so you can see how the pie splits up, For sort of the regular kid who doesn't fit into any of those other cost categories, that takes up about 75% of the pie in Tier 1. Educating poor kids. Remember, we showed you 60% of our kids are poor, but we spend only 9% extra to try to make up for that difference, right? And you saw, in terms of the performance, where that 9% is getting us. The last time the state did a study on this, the state study showed instead of costing 20% more, it really cost 40% more. And that's a fairly conservative number. When you look at some of the other research, it says it's really double or more than that. And when I think about, my own kid and my own family and how much we invest at home in her education, because we can afford to, it doesn't surprise me at all that it would be double or more than double that. When you think about if we're really trying to close the gaps and make up for not having access to all of those things, that doesn't surprise me at all. Tier 2 of the program is what we call meaningful local discretion, and so it's supposed to provide access to a substantially equalized program in excess of the basic program to provide for services that a district wants to provide on top of what the state requires, essentially. And so the way that they've done that is they've said, well, we're going to provide equalization up to a certain amount, right? The state can't afford to give all districts what the wealthiest district in Texas can get. So what they've done is for most districts, they've pegged it to what Austin can raise, interestingly enough, because Austin's a fairly wealthy district. That was a political decision. It sounded good at the time. And so Austin, for the first 6 pennies above your Tier 1, the state will give you enough extra money so that you can raise what Austin can raise. That's what they tell everyone across the state. Now, if you go beyond those 6 pennies, the state at the time didn't want to encourage you to raise your rate, right? And it almost began to feel like for a conservative legislature, like they were providing matching dollars for you to raise taxes. Raising taxes is not a very popular thing here, and so that did not go over well. So for anything above those 6 pennies gets equalized at a much lower level, at $31.95 per penny per kid.
You said we could answer a question?
Yes.
When you're looking at that, is it my understanding correct, or I was just not listening, that any federal funds can't be included in that in figuring out if we need to do this or that?
You're correct. Federal funds are outside everything I've talked about right now. And it's an interesting question in terms of whether they can be included in thinking about constitutional requirements. The last time we went to court, kind of what the researchers did was for all of the equity arguments, they left federal funds out. And they said that state and local revenue should be equal, exclusive of federal funds. And that's particularly important if you think about the biggest pot of federal money is to provide kids free lunches. So is it really appropriate to look at free lunch money or special education money on the one hand and compare it to a district who doesn't have those same needs and say, well, it's equal. So those were left out. Sometimes for adequacy studies, in terms of thinking, is it enough money in the system, sometimes they're left in those analyses. Do you have enough money to accomplish what you're supposed to accomplish? The lunch money, to me, should certainly always be out. So that's a hotly debated argument, actually. So it's an interesting question. And then finally, the legislature implemented Robin Hood, right, which is the much maligned recapture provisions in the education code, which is essentially where the state said we cannot afford to lift everyone up to the same level, so we'll pick a level, we'll lift everyone up to that level. Anything a district collects on top of that, they've got to give back to us, and then we'll redistribute that. The first iteration of that was deemed unconstitutional, and so the state actually came back with a fairly clever, this was back in the early 90s, a fairly clever response, which was to say, okay, you don't have to send us back your money. In fact, we'll let your voters choose, and they can choose either to send us back the money, send the money to another district, or just let us take away some of their property. And that's because the state draws the district lines. Those aren't locally determined. And so it's the state that's in charge of organizing this system and creating a funding system that works. So what the state drew, the state can undraw. So since that time, most of the elections have passed. When the voters understand what their choices really are, turns out they would rather hold on to that property and send a little money back to Austin, much as they don't enjoy doing that. Neither do we here in Austin. But there have been a couple of elections that have failed in recent years, interestingly enough. And I think that I actually think those may become an issue down the road. Just because of the political mood of the country right now, with anything on a ballot that has to do with taxes, it's fairly tough. So that's essentially what the recapture provisions are designed to do. What the state says in Tier 1 is anything you raise beyond what we provide through the basic allotment, you have to send back. In Tier 2, interestingly enough, if you're wealthier than Austin, for 6 pennies, you get to keep anything you raise. So for 6 pennies of your tax rate, there is a recapture-free zone. And then if you want to go above those 6 pennies, you have to send everything back that you can raise above the $31.95 state guarantee. So there's a little bit of a bump built in for property wealthy districts there. And most people choose simply to send their money back to the state. So where did we end up? We had the West Orange Cove decision in 2005, which said, in terms of equity, it's not perfect, but it's good enough right now. In terms of adequacy, it said we're headed off the cliff. We're headed toward the cliff, but we haven't gone over it yet, and we're not going to call it unconstitutional until we're there. But we do have a state property tax. And so what did the legislature do with that decision? Well, it had to provide local communities more room on their tax rate to choose either to tax or not tax, to do things locally. And there are 3 ways, basically, that they could have accomplished those goals, right? They could have simply provided more money to cover what the state was requiring districts to do, and that would have freed up some money for local districts to use for local priorities. They could have reduced the cost of complying with state priorities, right? They could have lowered standards. They could have undone 4x4, made the tests easier, or thought of some technological advancement, right, that made it significantly cheaper to educate kids in Texas. And that technological advancement has not yet shown itself. There's some people who talk about the promise of virtual schools and online kinds of learning and electronics. I think there is some promise there, but what they found in the research so far is that for virtual schools and those kinds of things, for kids who have a lot of support at home, they work pretty well, and they do save the state money, right? Because really what you're doing is you're shifting between state-paid labor and family-paid labor, right? There's somebody at home doing one-to-one coaching. For the kiddos who've tried it who don't have that support at home, the results have been pretty bleak. Because they're still kids, right? And they still require a fair amount of cheering and coaching and motivating and those kinds of things. We haven't found a cheaper way to get that done yet. Or they could simply, but remember this is Texas, but they could simply tell local communities you can tax at a higher rate if you want to. All the districts were taxing at the maximum rate allowed by the law, which at that time was $1.50 per $100 of property value. They could have raised that to $1.75. Not a very politically popular choice at the time. So what did they do? They cut taxes, right? They said, okay, everybody has to reduce their tax rates by 1/3. You were at $1.50, then over the next 2 years, you've got to cut your base tax rate to $1. And we'll provide you enough revenue at the state level to make up the difference. And then you can go back up, and that'll give you your local capacity. But you can't go all the way back up to $1.50 because the legislature wanted to take some credit for passing a tax cut bill. So they said you can go up to $1.17. You can't go up to where you were, you can go up to $1.17. They passed a reform package, which included a number of things that frankly made schooling more expensive. They were good things: teacher pay raise, new state tests, ability for the commissioner to go in and close schools that weren't performing well. So they passed a lot of education reforms that cost some money. And then they said, we'll let you raise your tax rate 4 pennies just because the school board wants to, but if you want to go further than that, you've got to get your local voters. You've got to pass that election by a vote of the people, which was new for school districts. So they made it significantly harder for districts to access that local discretion. They could only access a little bit of it. What did the legislature not do in 2005 in response to West Orange Code? They never in any way tried to link the funding system to the requirements. In 2003, they had made sort of a stab at doing a study that said, what is it we're trying to achieve and what does it cost to achieve that? That effort did not go well, resulted in a number of special sessions that did not succeed, and they haven't really wanted to go there again since. So in nowhere in the statutes or in the legislative record have we made a real effort to find out what it costs to do what we're asking districts to do. They didn't change the cost adjustments created in the mid-'80s, early '90s. So all of those still reflect the Texas that existed at that time. They didn't do anything to eliminate discrepancies between high wealth and low wealth districts. And most importantly, they didn't pass a tax bill that generated the same revenue that the property tax cuts did. They were sitting on some fund balance at the time, some extra revenue. And they remember how hard it was to get them to spend the rainy day fund this time?
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't hard then. They simply spent their surplus revenue, even though they weren't generating on a long-term basis enough new revenue to cover the tax cuts that they were passing. And they created what we call target revenue. And target revenue is whatever you used to get under old law. And they've modified that a few times over the year to include some things that the legislature wanted to do. So it used to be whatever you would get under old law, then it was whatever you used to get under old law plus a teacher pay raise, plus a certain amount per student. But anyway, it's based on what you used to get under old law. And so any of the old law inequities that were based on property wealth or tax rates or formula bonuses, frankly, for some districts that other districts didn't get, were built into that target. And I'll show you a graph of it here. This is I just pulled the districts over 10,000. This shows you the difference in what they got under old law and what's built into the formulas today. That ranges from sort of in the low $4,500 neighborhood to the high, to close to 7,000. And I cut the top off. There are a handful of districts that are up there at 12,000 or so per student. Those tend to be very small districts. But there are, this does narrow the band a little bit. And just in terms of, just to kind of quantify by how much did they not fund tax reduction, we were estimating for 2010-11, one school year, if we had our old tax rates, we would have generated almost $24 billion in tax revenue. But at our new tax rates, we only generate $17.2 billion in tax revenue, so that leaves $6.7 billion a year that the legislature needs to make up that we're not collecting anymore because we've reduced the rates. But the state passed $2.2 billion a year in revenue measures. They thought it was a little more than that at the time. It turned out not to have performed as well as they thought it would. And so that leaves a shortfall per year of $4.5 billion that they've got to find to continue to pay for the tax relief passed in 2005. So that's a core problem, right? That's a core piece of the problem we face. And is a big part, and not all of the reason, but part of the reason that the legislature found itself in the hole it did last session. Now, to be fair, there was also a recession going on. Sales tax collections were down. There were a number of other things going on, but that was a core piece of it. So what did the legislature, yes?
And that shortfall doesn't even take into account the increase in our student population.
It doesn't, that's correct. The increase in our student population, and also, to be fair, the legislature did provide for a teacher pay raise and things like that, so that's other money that they've got to find. So they really just don't have the revenue structure in place to keep up with the demands, in my opinion, that we've got in our school system. Yes?
And it was the first time ever that they didn't fund the growth.
Yes. The last legislative session was the first time since, anyone that we could find to ask during the legislative session. My boss has been doing this since the 70s, and he can't recall a time when we didn't fund the basic formulas. Now, we didn't always think those formulas were enough, and we didn't always provide the increases we wanted, but we always had told school districts, you get this core base amount of money so you can plan on it. And what we found this time was that here we were in the summer, still in a special session, trying to figure out how much school districts were going to have to open school up in August. How many teachers can you hire? Those kinds of things. So it was a tough situation.
Are you saying that this past session cut even more money that they were providing for education? Is that what you're saying, below what they're keeping there?
So the formulas that I showed you just now have been reduced by the recent legislative session.
Because they cut it.
Because they cut those core funding formulas. And we'll talk here about what were the cuts that they made in order to be able to get out of the session without using the rainy day fund, without raising taxes. The first thing they did was they took $4 billion out of the core funding formulas, that's what we've been talking about this whole time, right? The core, so that's $2 billion a year. And then they took $1.4 billion out of local grant programs. Those local grant programs tend to go for educating children who are struggling, children who are at risk, children who are economically disadvantaged, right? For example, the pre-kindergarten grant program was a program that was to take half-day pre-K programs, which we offer for economically disadvantaged kids, and extend them to full day. So the state took that pot of money away, took away the money for the Student Success Initiative, which is money school districts use for after-school programs for kids who are struggling to meet state standards, took away the DATE program, which is a teacher incentive pay program.
All of those issues hurt the underprivileged child.
I'm sorry?
All of those issues that they cut out just depleted any kind of success for the underprivileged child.
Most of these, certainly the pre-K program and the Student Success Initiative, both were really targeted at low-income kids. Yeah. And probably more importantly, or equally importantly, the $2 billion a year in the core formula funding for school districts, because that's the money that you count on to kind of run your day-to-day operations. So real quickly, I think on the next slide we show you how they did that. And essentially, some people say, well, did they fund enrollment growth? The state says, sure we did, right? We pay you some money for every new kid that's in the system. We just pay you less for each kid that's in the system. So they gave you essentially a reduction to what we call the regular program, which was that 75% of the pie that I showed you before. That was reduced to sort of 92% of what it used to be. In the first year of the biennium, and in the second year of the biennium, they instead put some of that money back and took money from the higher spending districts. And that was a huge fight all legislative session, right? The low-funded districts were saying, if you've got to take it, don't take it from me. I'm already running on less than what my neighbors have. And the high-funding districts were saying, I can't absorb that kind of hit all in one year. And so that was the fight of the legislative session, basically those two arguments playing out. And in the very last moments of the special session, they came to a compromise, which was across the board in year one, and then make a stab at more equalizing kind of a program in year two. And I think I have a graph, yeah. So this shows you, now to be fair, the base there, the access is 4,000 to 7,500. So it's the graph, right, is set up to show you the differences. The differences will look larger on this scale. But across the bottom there, we've got the school districts lined up based on property wealth. And so the blue bar is what they used to have before the cuts of the last legislative session in formula funding. And then the red bar is what they are getting this school year. And then the green bar is what they get next school year. And so you can see the green bar is higher than the red bar for the first set, the lower property wealth districts. So everybody took about the same cut in the first year. The lower property wealth districts get some of their cut back in the second year. And then the highest four categories there will take a second cut in the second year of the biennium. And that's how they're able to afford to give the lower funded districts some of their money back. Nobody gets back to where they started. So in some school districts, you'll see that they can put back some programs next year. In other districts, here in Austin, for example, you'll see they're going to be talking about a second round of program reductions in the second year of the biennium. So that's basically how they structured those cuts.
On that slide,
Yeah.
the number on the left was the amount of spending per child, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
right. And again, so it's 4,000 to 7,500. So it's designed to show you the difference there. So that brings us to where we are today, which was that I'd say about half of the school districts in the state at this point have signed on with one of 4 litigant groups that have elected to sue the state over an inadequate school finance system. And we'll talk a little bit about those. Before I guess we'll talk real quickly about who the litigant groups are. In Texas, because there are so many differences in the kinds of districts we have, they tend to group up based on common interests, right? So the 4 litigant groups are MALDEF, which is the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund that'll be pursuing a claim really primarily focused around language issues of equity, especially for limited English proficient children. There's the Texas Taxpayer and Student Fairness Coalition, which tend to be property poor school districts. There is a group of litigant districts, I think led by Fort Bend ISD, which tend to be kind of mid-range districts. They've got some of the big urban districts, Houston, Dallas, Austin, and also a lot of suburban districts. And then there's the Texas School Coalition, which tend to be the property wealthy districts.
It's ours.
All of those groups are saying that the system is inadequate. And all of those groups are saying we can't afford to do what the state and our communities expect given the resources we have. They're just coming at it from different perspectives. So the 4 claims, the 3 are old. We've litigated them many times before, and 1 is new. The first is adequacy, which is that rising standards combined with funding cuts leave insufficient revenue to provide for the general diffusion of knowledge. You cannot, in the same session, you demand that children begin to pass end-of-course examinations to graduate from high school, provide for a funding cut, and make no effort to link the two. Is kind of fundamentally the argument that they're going to be making. That again, school districts lack meaningful discretion. I think you'll likely see some of the property wealthy districts argue specifically that the requirement for voter authorization in a district that has to send half their revenue back to the state is just a non-starter. I can't pass an election where my taxpayers know that they're only going to keep half of what they raise. Politically, we can't get it done, so it's not really meaningful local discretion. An efficiency equity argument that says that the state has not done enough to narrow the gaps in terms of revenue per student. And interestingly, this time we have some taxpayers in that argument who are saying, I'm paying at a higher rate than I should have to because you've drawn the district boundaries in such a way that my district can't raise what it needs to raise at a rate that it could charge if I live somewhere else. And then for the first time, which I think will be very interesting, there's a rationality claim, which frankly, it's a fairly low constitutional standard, but it says this mess is, 1, so complicated I can't explain it to either my parents or my taxpayers, and 2, there's no rational basis for it. There's no meaningful reason laid out in statute that District A gets this much, District B gets that much. The funding cuts that they made were simply how do we get back the revenue we need to make the budget balance, and didn't have anything to do with what do we think it costs to provide an education to kids. And so at minimum, what this argument says is the state has to have some rational basis for the way it funds schools based on something besides funds available. And Billy, you can pass. So some of the questions that we have as we head into litigation are, how good does our system have to be to meet the general diffusion of knowledge? Last time the court said it's looking bad, but we're not there yet. They didn't really define what there is. So what is it that we have to show in terms of educational harm in order to say we've hit that place? Is this even a subject that the courts can grapple with in terms of what is the cost of providing an adequate education? So far, every time we've gone to court, the state has argued, no, this is not an appropriate thing for the courts to decide. It's too complex. There's too much variation. And the courts have so far been very careful to defend that as their turf. And they've said, yes, it is up to us. We don't think you've met the inadequacy threshold yet, but we do reserve right to pass judgment on that. They'll have another opportunity to look at that question this time. We hope they give the same answer. How do evolving state standards work into the equation? Can you continue to ask more from kids and not provide more from the adults that are there to take care of the system? And then finally, what about the outdated cost measures? What about the fact that we haven't looked at the poverty weight in over 20 years. Does that make it an irrational system? So those are the kinds of questions that they'll be dealing with. In terms of equity, in 2004 they said it was good enough. So has the degradation in the system since 2004, is that sufficient to push us over the threshold? One of the things that happened this time was the state said, okay, we recognize that the system we have right now is inequitable. Starting in 2017, we'll repeal it. Will that have any weight? The state's argument's going to be we've taken care of it, right? We just need some time to get there. Will the courts be deferential to that statement? That I'm sure will be an argument. What about debt service? This is the money that districts use to build their facilities program. And we didn't talk very much about that today, but that's been a very neglected program over the years. We set the yield back in the early 90s, and that hasn't changed even though property values have grown over time. And so what about debt service? And then what about the no recapture on 6 pennies? Has that thrown the system into unconstitutional inequity? Okay. In terms of meaningful discretion, one of the analyses that we've run is that if all the districts were to use up all their discretion and tax at the maximum tax rate, it would about get them back what the state cut this time. A little bit more, but not very much more. So did that cut effectively take away their meaningful discretion? If you're already at $1.17, have you lost meaningful discretion? We've got over 300 districts that have already gone up to that maximum rate. Their voters have given them permission. And then does the fact that you need to get voter approval for every tax rate limit meaningful discretion in any way? And then finally, in terms of rationality, we've got some districts that are funded by the formulas and other districts that are funded based on what they used to get in 06-07. Do those two separate and unequal funding systems, is that a rational approach to this? Does the use of cost adjustments from the 1980s, is there a rational basis for their continued use? And are the long-term commitments that we have to our funding formula sufficient to finance the standards that we've put in place? So the discovery process is underway. We think that we haven't set officially the timeline for trial, but we expect to go to trial in the fall. Or at least that's, I think, what the litigant districts hope. The state's going to have some response to that, but that would give you a district court decision. It'll all play out here in the Travis County District Court under Judge Dietz, who heard this all the last time, so he has some familiarity with it. But that should give us at least a district court decision before the next legislative session. Whether or not that leads to legislative action, we'll have to see. But that's where we are. Essentially, we see the litigation as only a step in the process. Whatever the courts decide, it's the legislature that has to implement a solution. And so that means that you need meaningful public engagement around these issues because the legislature will respond to voters. And so without, the litigation can only be one component of a strategy to improve the funding system. It can't be the whole thing. We have to go back to the legislature at some point. And that's all I had. I'm happy to take questions if you guys have any. Wow.